My name is Andy Cahan. I'm the Ruth W. and A. Morris Williams Jr. Director of Author Events, and I'm very pleased to welcome our guest this evening. Believe it or not, it has been more than 16 years since James Carroll spoke from this stage about his National Book Award-winning memoir, An American Requiem, God, My Father, and the War That Came Between Us. If you had been here or listened to the podcast, you know that you're in store for a thoughtful presentation this evening. Was anybody here for that? Bravo. Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. Mr. Carroll has written too many columns and books to describe since his last appearance, but to suffice it to say, he's an award-winning columnist for the Boston Globe, as well as the best-selling author of 11 novels and 7 works of nonfiction, including the New York Times best-selling Constantine's Sword and House of War, which won the first PEN-Galbraith Award, an award that is given every 2 years to a distinguished book of general nonfiction possessing notable literary merit and critical perspective and illuminating important contemporary issues. He has been called one of the most adept and versatile writers on the American scene today. His latest, Christ Actually, the Son of God for the Secular Age, more than proves the point. Please join me in welcoming James Carroll back to the Free Library of Philadelphia.
I can't breathe. Hands up, don't shoot. I can't breathe. Black Lives Matter. I can't breathe. Whether we want it to be or not, that is our text this evening. I'm really honored to be here. Very pleased. Walking out like that makes me feel like Johnny Carson, if you remember him. I want to thank Andy Cahan and all the folks at the Philadelphia Free Library for having me back. I know very well what a distinguished author series this is. Proud to be part of it. This library actually is where every author wants to go. Does that make Philadelphia author heaven? For me tonight, that's what it is. I appreciate your coming out. But our text suggests a grave context for this time. When I began some couple of months ago looking forward to being with you here after the welcome from Andy and others to present my new book, we did not know that by now this nation would be upended by recognitions tied to Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, and others. And we are a properly chastened people. Hands up. I can't breathe. My book is called Christ Actually, the Son of God for the Secular Age. When I speak of what I have written here, I usually center my remarks on that tension, the way normally we treat faith in the Son of God as opposed to the secular age. In my book, I lay out a whole set of oppositions and show how, horribly enough, this structure of conflict is tied in some way to what we think of Jesus Christ. So, Son of God versus the secular age, faith versus reason, religion versus science, miracles versus evidence, one side of the brain versus another, us versus them. The argument of my book is straightforward, that the profound oppositionalisms that might be understood as cursing the human condition take the form they do in Western culture overwhelmingly because of the greatest story ever misremembered. I argue that while the conflict laid bare in this country, in Ferguson, Cleveland, and New York, has many sources, it draws a lethal energy from a conflict that lies buried beneath the surface of Western civilization itself, going back to a misremembered Jesus Christ. I want, and I admit it's outrageous of me, I want to suggest that there is a bug in the software of Christianity. And I want to argue further that it became a bug in the software of Western civilization, which is showing up here and now with fresh and undeniable power. Black lives matter less than white lives. Immigrants, too, matter less. What is that? Where does it come from? In fact, we could recite a whole litany of oppositions, all rooted, if not exclusively, in some way essentially, in the structure of the imagination of what we used to call Christendom. Moving backward in time with me, if you will. Come backward in time with me. From white versus black in America to slave versus free, to settlers versus native peoples, to retracing the way back across the oceans to European imperialist adventurers versus people of color elsewhere, black, but also brown, yellow, red. Everywhere, the Europeans, newly self-conscious as whites, established their colonies. Go back further even to those Pope-launched crusades against infidel Muslims. The Pope said, God wills it, which precisely in Europe's founding centuries, the very decades and centuries in which Europe came into itself as a whole entire culture, exactly then, crusades established a positive, negative bipolarity between Christendom and Islam a tension that defines world conflict to this day. This crusade, President Bush said, as if it were a baseball reference, this war on terror, and the true revelation of his having used that word was in his not understanding its historical implications, of course, which were immediately and painfully evident throughout the Arab world. I know what you're thinking. I'm oversimplifying a vast and complex question. Perhaps I am. It's a risk I'm taking. I want to suggest a connection with such white, black, positive, negative imagination, a connection that puts a profound responsibility on those of us who revere the memory of Jesus Christ, or who understand him at least as an important cultural figure in world history. Hands up. Don't shoot. Somehow, the generating paradigm of racist contempt goes back to a sacred and still vital Christian contempt for Jews. That's my argument. The blood impurity of Jews, an invention of the Inquisition, moved what had been religious anti-Judaism into racial anti-Semitism. It's a crucially important distinction. After the Inquisition, with the blood impurity charge against Jews, racism was invented. Before, Jews could become acceptable to Christian society by accepting baptism. But in the 15th and 16th centuries, even baptized Jews were unacceptable, denigrated oddly with that word conversos, used as a term of contempt for Jews who had converted or who were descended from Jews who had converted. Conversos. They were not eligible to hold municipal office in many places throughout Spain, and they were not qualified even to enter the holy orders of the church. The Jesuits, for example, banned anyone of Jewish descent to the 5th generation going back from entering the Society of Jesus. A restriction that was lifted only after the Holocaust. Imagine the greatest treasure of the church, the Jesuits, having such a rule in their constitution. This is biological contempt for Jews and Judaism. And where had it come from? From centuries of the church versus the synagogue, a positive-negative structure of Christian self-understanding that still shows up in the way we Christians speak of grace versus law, faith versus works, spirituality versus materialism, generosity versus greed, all the way back to something as basic as new versus old, as in New Testament versus Old Testament. What really does that mean? New, vital, with a future, full of life, energy, positive qualities, all, versus the outmoded, the left behind, the obsolete, the thing to be forgotten, rejected. The New Testament, God of mercy, versus the Old Testament, God of revenge. What is that? You could say that such bipolarity is tied to the structure of the human brain, or maybe it's tied to universal human pressures of our ancient tribal roots. Survival, a matter of knowing who's in our circle over against those outside of it who are a threat to us. Survival depends on our knowing who we are over against them. But when it comes to the church and the Jews, something cosmic is made of this perhaps primordial human tension. Something apocalyptic. For with the deicide charge, the charge against the Jewish people that in killing Jesus they killed God, this tension becomes a matter of divine mandate. God against the Jewish people. This bipolarity is transcendent. It's eternal. It's willed by God, which is why down through the centuries the church could feel licensed to affirm it and exploit it in countless ways. Leading, we know very well where it led. After recognitions tied to the Holocaust, which stripped bare the uneasy anti-Jewish conscience of the West, the churches, thank God, renounced that deicide charge, declaring especially at the Roman Catholic Second Vatican Council in 1965 that the Jewish people must not be indicted as Christ killers, the seed of anti-Semitism. A momentous change in Christian thought and theology that we are ever properly grateful for. It transformed the structure of Jewish-Christian relations and enabled a fulfillment of the great Jewish-Christian dialogue that Jewish leaders themselves had initiated with generosity and bravery after World War II. But since the renunciation of the Christ killer charge, Christians have been mostly complacent about this problem, as if we're finished with it, as if we've done enough. And the truth is we've barely begun to address it, because the Christ killer charge is only the tip of the iceberg. Here is the bug in the software. The entire story of Jesus, not just his death, the entire story of Jesus is told as a story of Jesus against the Jews. Everywhere you look in the Gospels and in Acts of the Apostles, we find this with the contemptuous phrase, the Jews, used over and over and over again, well over 100 times, almost always defining the Jews as the enemy of Jesus, as if he were not one of them. Jesus is remembered as if he were a Gentile. All of his virtues, kindness, egalitarianism, feminism, mercy, universalism, are seen in contrast to Jewish venality, legalism, tribalism, chauvinism, selfishness, pettiness, greed. The parables, the beloved parable of the Good Samaritan, It could also be called the parable of the bad Jews, because the Good Samaritan's behavior is in contrast to the priest and the lawyer, the Jews, who have their reasons for not helping. The Gospel of John. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. No. His own, the Jews, were the only ones who received Jesus. They were it. They were all Jews. They loved him. And when he died and went away, as the Jewish Roman historian Josephus says, they could not let go of their affection for him. To me, the most poignant line in history. They could not let go of their affection for him. They were Jews. Jesus was a Jew, fully, completely. We would say today, an Orthodox Jew. His head covered whenever he was out. An Orthodox Jew to the day he died, preaching not a God of love against a God of judgment, but the one God of Israel, whose judgment and love are one. More, Jesus Christ was a Jew. Often Christians imagine that the affirmations attached to his being Christ, being Messiah, cut him off from Jews who could not accept those affirmations. The categories within which Jesus was understood, and perhaps understood himself, as Messiah, as Son of God even, as raised from the dead, as somehow divine, as seated, as the Creed says, at the right hand of the Father, these categories and affirmations come right out of the center of Jewish expectation and Scripture. For contingent historical reasons, having nothing to do with the will of God, and having mainly to do with what I presume to call the first Holocaust, which was the Roman war against the Jewish people, which ancient historians tell us killed perhaps 2 million Jews, and having mainly to do also with the intra-Jewish civil war that the Roman war sparked among Jews, as imperial oppressors often do, the way London sparked a civil war between Irish Catholics and Irish Protestants, or the way London sparked a civil war between Hindus and Muslims on the subcontinent of Asia, or between Palestinian Arabs and Jewish Israelis in the Palestinian Mandate territory, the way imperial systems always get oppressed people at each other as a way of keeping them from being at the system. So that sparked a civil war between two groups of Jews, one of whom affirmed Jesus as Messiah and the other of whom did not. The Civil War and the Roman War were both raging just as the Gospels were written. You know this, but remember it. The Gospels were not eyewitness accounts written shortly after the death of Jesus. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not the authors of the Gospels. We don't know who the authors were. They lived decades later. They probably didn't know Jesus. The earliest Gospel, Mark, was written in the year 70. Jesus died in the year 30. Scholars are unanimous now in understanding the composition of the Gospels between 70 and 100. Mark in 70, Matthew and Luke in the 80s, John in around the year 100. And what was going on then? In the year 70, those of you who are Jews in this room know this very well, the temple was destroyed. The Romans, that is, destroyed the center of Jewish belief. It's not like destroying St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. It was more than that, much more than that. It was destroying the place where Jews met God, where God lived among the people Israel. It had rooted Jewish religion for 1,000 years. And then poof, one day it is gone. And the Romans are slaughtering people by the tens of thousands. Josephus says that in that 1 year, 70, in the siege, the Romans crucified 10,000 resisting Jews and left their cadavers on crosses all around the center of Jerusalem as a signal of what happens to you if you resist Rome. And it was this trauma that set two groups of Jews in tension with each other. One saying, now the temple must be observance of law and study of Torah more than ever. And the other saying, now the temple must be Jesus. Indeed, the Gospel of Mark, which can be plausibly understood as having been written in response to the destruction of the temple, has Jesus identify himself as the new temple. Destroy this temple, he is remembered as saying, and in 3 days I will raise it up again, which generates the rage of those Jews listening to him. What is happening here? Mark is suggesting a way to make sense of the destruction of the temple that just happened. And later Christians will read that text as Gentiles, not understanding how it was written, imagining that it was written shortly after the year 30, and read it as Jesus foreseeing the future, which is almost certainly not what was going on. Read it, that is, as proof that Jesus is God, and proof that Jesus has rejected the Jewish people by rejecting the temple. And then when the Romans destroy the temple, it's as if Jesus' position has been affirmed. So for Christians, the destruction of the temple becomes a note of satisfaction and triumph, while for Jews, it remains to this day a source of grief, centering an observance, Tisha B'Av, every year. To read the Gospels without reference to the Roman war that was unfolding as they were written is like, and that's the way Christians always read them, is like reading the diary of Anne Frank without reference to the Holocaust. The result? Jesus against the Jews, as if he were not one of them. That is the bug in the software of the church, which became the bug in Western civilization. How to debug the software. Even as I say it again, I have to apologize for this metaphor. So much of our time, isn't it? We could talk about this as something amiss in the DNA. How to debug the software. I'm addressing a broad cultural question, but we Christians, those of us who are Christians, have a profound responsibility here. And I'll close by making 3 quick points. First, we must understand far more fully than we do how our texts, our apparently anti-Jewish texts, came to be written that way. And central to that knowledge is knowledge of the Roman destruction of the temple, exactly as that first gospel, Mark, was being written. Without the temple, we have to remember this. Every Jew was thrown into crisis with 2 answers. What is it to be a Jew without the temple? One, the rabbis, and the other, the Jesus people. A conflict unfolding within the people Israel. There is nothing more Jewish, I can presume to say from outside, than Jews arguing over what it is to be a good Jew. And that's what this was. And the argument became polemical, and the more time passed from Mark in 70 to John in 100, the more polemical the Gospels became. So that the most ferocious anti-Semitic gospel, anti-Jewish gospel, is John. Because by then this fierce argument had taken a lethal turn. In John, Jesus identifies the Jewish people with the devil. The argument was unfolding among people, all of whom were Jews. It was not the Jews over there. It was those Jews don't accept Jesus as Messiah, unlike us Jews over here who do. But when finally the Romans, in the climax of the Roman war, destroyed the entire city of Jerusalem in 135, the center of Jewish Christian belief was eliminated, and from then on, Gentiles dominated the Jesus movement. And soon enough, they forgot its Jewish origins, they forgot the Jewish character of the Gospels themselves, and they forgot the Jewishness of Jesus. It became possible for them to imagine that he was one of them. But that was wrong. Jesus was a Jew, period, full stop. If Christians had not forgotten that, the history of the last 2,000 years, culminating in Auschwitz, would be very different. Second, we Christians must measure everything we believe about Jesus against this full and permanent Jewishness. Therefore, none of this merciful God of the New Testament rescuing us from the damning God of the Old Testament. We should let go of that language altogether, in fact, and refer more respectfully to Hebrew Scriptures on their own terms. We must, in effect, change what theologians call our Christology, our theology of Christ. Jesus was human. Denying his Jewishness is denying that he was human. Jesus was, yes, in some way divine. We affirm that as Christians. But we must grasp the divinity of Jesus in ways that do not set him against his own people, with, for example, very shallow notions of Jewish monotheism. This requires a re-examination, for example, of the Greek philosophical terms of our basic theology, of what gives us the Christian creeds. And it also implies a rediscovery of the Jewish modes of thinking in which Jesus himself and his first followers understood him. And always, we must remember that when we say Jesus was somehow God, we do not know, except in what the mystic called the cloud of unknowing, what such language actually means. What if the so-called divinity of Jesus lays bare not so much the mystery of God as the majesty of what it is to be human? If Jesus was in some way divine, so will we all be. So a changed understanding of Jesus now is essential. And third, we Christians must hear the anti-Jewish texts of the New Testament as if we ourselves are Jews. If you're a Christian, invite a Jewish friend to come to church with you, not just to the slanderous liturgies of Holy Week, when the death of Jesus is remembered, his blood be upon us and upon our children. No. Invite a Jewish friend to services any Sunday and listen with them. Why, they might ask, has the word Pharisee, which I know refers to a pious and devoted and noble tradition in Israel, why has the word Pharisee become a synonym for hypocrite in English? Who are these, the Jews, I keep hearing about? Why is every virtue of Jesus shown in contrast to some Jews' villainy? Once we hear and read our texts with a Jewish ear and eye, we will want something, maybe we will demand something new from our preachers. Nothing less than that they should learn how to use these texts, how to preach these texts against themselves as the occasion of a deep Christian repentance. Hands up. Don't shoot. Black lives matter. We see that, don't we? But what I'm hoping for is that we might more fully respond to deeper things that we can learn in the names of Eric and Michael and Tamir. Black versus white, us versus them, the West versus Islam, science versus religion, the Son of God against the secular age, positive against negative. Are we condemned to such bipolarity? The answer must be no. That negation, of course, is the affirmation of the faith. All human divisions, those between us and those within us, can be reconciled. This is the faith. In the oneness of God. Shema Israel. Who is the one God of Israel. The one God of all people. The creator of the cosmos. In whose love, so this religion says, we all find our hope. And in whom, so this religion says, we will all find our peace, or no one does. May Eric and Michael and Tamir rest in peace, and may their families find justice in this nation. Of course they won't, unless we, this entire society, finds a new way to give it to them. And that task belongs not to God, but to us. The great privilege of being at the Philadelphia Free Library is the chance to be in conversation with people well known to be the smartest people in the United States. So we do have a few minutes, and I'd thank you. We have kind folks here who have microphones. If you raise your hand, I'll recognize you, and then if you'd wait for the mic. Yes, sir. Yes, sir, please.
No?
The duality that you're talking about, that you say is, I think rightfully so, embedded in our society, is the antidote perhaps not Christianity or Judaism or some combination of both, but in actually Buddhism? Mm-hmm. Will it come from the East?
The Buddhist tradition is precious to us. We learn so much from it, and there is a kind of sense of the unity of all existence. I'm no expert on Buddhism, but as I gather you do, I'm full of gratitude for the tradition. I didn't mean to imply that the answer is Christianity or Judaism or any particular religion. The answer belongs to all of us as human beings. And I do take seriously the separation of church and state in the United States and understand that the political problem that's been laid bare in the last several weeks by these manifestations of a broken justice system is a secular problem. It belongs to the nation and its politics. Religion informs the problem. That's my point. And if we were living in a Buddhist majority population, we might reckon in some similar way with similar problems. There are Buddhist nations with Tamil rebels, for example, who are also confronted with challenges of religious violence, violence justified by appeals to the transcendent. So all religious people have to engage in what I'm doing here, which is religious self-criticism. I'm focused on Christianity, a self-critical look at Christian history, because that's my tradition. And for better and for worse, that's what you're stuck with here tonight. But you knew that coming in, because my book has the name Christ Actually for a title. But my suggestion is that every religious tradition has a version of this work to do. Jews who revere the Hebrew Scriptures and the Talmud have their problematic texts too. And Jews must, for example, read the anti-Canaanite texts of the book of Exodus as if they're Canaanites, because Canaanites are claimed as derivative ancestors of Palestinians. So to understand more fully the tension in the land, over the land, it can behoove people of Israel, Israeli Jews and other Jews, to read those texts that some extremist, ultra-nationalist Orthodox Jews are using texts to justify claims on the land against the Palestinian people, as if God defined the real estate. That religious claim needs to be criticized. And Israeli Jews are doing that powerfully now. It's an example of what I'm talking about. All religions in the world where violence has been terribly escalated by religious claims need to be self-critical. And it's obvious how this project belongs to Islam, because the jihadists who claim to act in the name of Islam must be much more fully and vigorously repudiated by the mainstream of Islam, which you hear more from Muslims than anyone. So, but before we, people of the West, are so focused in our criticism of Islam, or before we, liberal intelligentsia of Europe and America, are more critical of the state of Israel, which does all too easily morph over into old forms of anti-Semitism, we need to be self-critical ourselves. And it's not just religion. The single most damaging event in the Middle East in the last 15 years that escalated conflicts throughout, especially including between Israelis and Palestinians, and now in Syria, and having obviously in Iraq and Afghanistan, the most damaging single event in that whole inflamed region was the American intervention. Not just once, but twice and 3 times and again, an intervention that continues. We Americans need to be much more self-critical we are in our attitudes about religious violence in the Middle East. Well, that's another subject. Someone else wants to speak. Yes, way in the back, sir. And one of the microphones can come to you. There's a microphone right there, right coming. Thank you for waiting.
I'm a pastor in the United Methodist Church, and I thank you for your talk tonight and for your guidance over many years in uncovering anti-Semitism. I have used your work a lot, and the folks in my congregation get kind of tired of me being critical of our own tradition. I read the Bible with Jewish friends, and sometimes when we uncover some of the kind of stuff that you've been talking about tonight, we Christians say, well, we won't read that part, or we'll change that. And our Jewish friends say, no, you have to read that. You have to read that and say it's not true. You have to tell people that Judas, meaning Jew, is not the enemy. Somehow uncover that, somehow unroot that. And like I say, people get tired of that in my church, trying to do that. I appreciate your call for Vatican III and for those kind of changes. And I just wonder sometimes how we can go through such a deconstruction.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate your comments. And thank you for the kind word. And I identify fully with how tired people are of listening to you. You should ask my wife. One of the reviews of this book called me Christ-haunted, which is a phrase you'll recognize from Flannery O'Connor. I was honored to have a phrase from Flannery O'Connor applied to me. The review called me Christ-haunted and Holocaust-haunted. Some people feel like only Jewish people, especially survivors of the Holocaust or family members of those who did not survive, have the right or the responsibility to carry forward the memory of the Holocaust. And it belongs in a special way to those whose families died. But it belongs in another, but also special way, to those of us who are reckoning, who have been forced to reckon with the complicity of our tradition. The Holocaust was not caused by Christianity. It was caused by Hitler and the Nazis and the Third Reich. It's always important to insist on their particular culpability. But it's also important to insist that they could not have done it if they weren't drawing on centuries-long traditions of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, which were not the sins of mobs, as some Christian leaders like to imagine, but were sacred affirmations coming from the heart of the church, Protestant and Catholic alike. So, yes, it is in a way tiresome of us to be obsessed. I'm at the age now where I've begun really recently to reckon with a true dread, which is that the waters will smooth over and the survivors will be dead and their family members will be dead, and the Holocaust will be something like what? the Battle of the Somme. Also a grotesque event in history. Tens of thousands of soldiers killing each other in a matter of weeks. And yet having no bite, no weight. Certainly not in America. Will the Holocaust weigh anything in the conscience of the West 100 years from now? That's my question. And will Christians have learned that Pontius Pilate was not a man of delicate conscience, who was forced into the killing of a man he found innocent? I wash my hands of this just man's blood. Let his blood be upon us and upon our children. That's the context. Pontius Pilate was no such person. Historians now can establish this. Not long, a couple of years after the death of Jesus, Pontius Pilate was removed by Rome because he was too brutal, even by Rome standards. He would have thought nothing of sending a troublemaking Galilean nobody out into the alley to be put to death. Would have thought nothing of it. You get no such portrait in the gospel. It didn't happen that way. And you're right. Preachers need to make that very clear. There, I'm doing it again. Someone else better rescue us. Yes, ma'am, over here. Yes, ma'am, please.
Just first of all, a word of personal privilege that my first year in seminary was in 1971 at Boston University School of Theology, and I lived on Bay State Road with 13 women who went to BUST, and I think you lived or worked across the street from us. We had you for dinner a couple times.
Yes. Yes, I remember.
Yeah, right. But anyway, I remember, and I have followed you all these years. I've been ordained 40 years now as a Presbyterian minister, and I brought for you to sign The Winter Name of God.
Oh,
which
my goodness.
I have
An
quoted.
ancient book.
But, you know, I just want to read a couple sentences back to you from that book because I just went to it after I've read part of Christ Actually. And you said, I'm standing here on the hill overlooking birth and death. It is Tisha B'Av, the late summer feast of Israel. It is the day of mourning for the destruction of the temple, the first in 586 BC, over which Jeremiah wept, and the second in AD 70, over which Jesus wept in advance. The temple was the house belief had built, grand and perfect, but it did not stand. Every one of us whose faith cracks in the night carries the destruction of the temple in his heart. And I've quoted that many times from my pulpit. A strategy I want to just suggest to everybody is that about, a year and a half, 2 years ago, 22 Presbyterians from Philadelphia and 22 Jews from Mainline Reformed Temple went together to Israel. And it was as though your book unfolded in our conversation as we went to sites and told our layered stories and then stayed up half the night talking together about what it meant and who we were. So I would just add that tonight. But the question I want to ask is, I haven't gotten there in your book yet, and I would love to hear you just say a word about Paul, who wrote before the destruction, right? And just give us a little teaser about that chapter.
Well, Paul is, his reputation is a casualty to this misremembering. And as you point out quite importantly, I make so much, don't I, in my remarks of that Roman war, which broke out in 68, and it went until, in several phases, until 135. It was the trauma, both peoples. Post-traumatic stress syndrome is a relevant point of reference. It was a trauma. It was the Holocaust. What the Holocaust did to the faith of many people, the Roman war did to the faith of many Jews. And it spawned two new religions, Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity. And the most important thing to carry into your reading of the letters of Paul is the insistent, emphatic knowledge that he died, scholars tell us, in 64 or 65. Paul knew nothing of the trauma. Paul took for granted the perennial, eternal character of the temple. He worshipped at the temple as an Orthodox Jew until the day he died. Whenever he was in Jerusalem, he went there. He brought the taxes, paying the tithing back to the Jerusalem temple from communities all over the Mediterranean whenever he returned to Jerusalem. Paul is remembered in the Catholic tradition as a convert. On January 25th in the Catholic liturgical calendar, we celebrate the conversion of St. Paul. It's when he became a Catholic. You Protestants know. He became a Catholic. No, Paul never became a Catholic. He never became a Christian. He was a Jew, period, to the end of time. And his first letter, scholars date it to around 50, is 1 Thessalonians, in which he does talk about the difference to his Jewish faith that the arrival of Jesus has made, and his faith in Jesus as Christ, what a difference it makes, and he celebrates that difference. But by the time of his last letter, Romans, written in about 60 or 61, he sees that some of the Jesus people are beginning to denigrate the Jewish people for not accepting Jesus. And the letter of Romans is a plea. Don't ever denigrate Israel. The promises God has made, God does not revoke. The covenant God made with the people of Israel is full and permanent and complete. That's in Romans. The fathers of the Second Vatican Council quoted that in repudiating the Christ killer charge. So Paul, it's a hugely illuminating chapter I've written on Paul. And no, really, I mean, Paul is the great. Thank God for Paul. His intuition about the meaning of Jesus. Paul is often regarded in a way as the founder of Christianity because he was the one who found the language with which to articulate the meaning of Jesus. It was an interpretation, and it was an ingenious Jewish interpretation. And thank God for Paul. Thank you, though, for that beautiful memory and for reading from that book, which was published in 1975. And I'm sure I was referring to the destruction of the temple. I don't know if I did, but I think I might have gone on to talk about my own small, somewhat petty instance of that experience, because it was the year after I was in Jerusalem that the church I was responsible for as a Catholic priest, it was during the tumultuous anti-war years, and someone set it on fire, and it burned to the ground, and I stood outside watching it burn, and it was a defining trauma for me, and it was also all too metaphoric for me. It was very much about my vocation to the priesthood that I experienced something deep happening. We have time for one more question. Yes, ma'am, please.
Thank you. I wonder if you might say something about your hopes and expectations, if you have any, for my first Jesuit Pope, of calling out some of the falseness of some of the binaries that you have laid out for us this evening.
Thank you for that. Yes, Pope Francis is an astonishment to me and embodies precisely the kind of hope I'm articulating here. On the subject of Jews and Christians, he's been much more forthright than anybody ever, even including the great John Paul II, who on the Jewish question was wonderfully prophetic because of his own experience of the Holocaust, of course. But Pope Francis, for example, not just speaking civilly of Jews and Judaism, but at several different places spontaneously saying things like, the world can never be grateful enough for the faithfulness of the Jewish people to the God of Israel. Now, wait a minute. What for centuries Jews were put to death for doing, now we can never be grateful enough to them. which he takes for granted, and his obvious preference of mercy over regulation, his preference of the disorder of freedom over the rigid control of authority, the ways in which he's made conservative Catholics, even some I've heard in Philadelphia, uncomfortable. All of these things are signals of a new day, the possibility of a new day. And I think the most important way in which for us Catholics, and maybe others, this man resonates is, this is all about Jesus for him. Jesus is the one on his knees before the feet of women and Muslims and prisoners that first Holy Thursday when he was Pope and went to the Roman prison and washed the feet of a Muslim woman, forbidden by canon law for Holy Thursday ritual to include women. He's up against the iron triangle of Catholicism, which is the bureaucracy, rigid doctrine, and all-male power. And that triangle is potent, and what he's able to do in relationship to it remains unfinished. We'll see. But he does make the possibility of profound change seem real. And if you can change the Renaissance papacy with the swiftness and ease and gentleness and humility, and without guilt-tripping anybody, and without saying, I'm better than the bishops who want to live in their palaces. No. For him to be able to do that cultural shift with such authenticity and ease is an astonishment. Remember, he never spent the night once in the apostolic palace, which has been the home of popes for centuries. Not once. He lives in a 2-room apartment in a kind of courtyard Marriott in the Vatican, on the Vatican grounds. It's what it is. It's a kind of sacred courtyard Marriott. And he eats many, if not most, of his meals in the cafeteria on the first floor. And who's the guy in white over there with his tray? It's an astonishment. I was privileged to, I've never met him, but I was privileged to be close to him and watch him. I watched him after an audience in St. Peter's Square where there were 100,000 people. At the end of the formal ceremony, he went, as he always does, he went down to the first row where the people in wheelchairs are put. And he went, there were maybe 50 people in wheelchairs. And he went, while 100,000 people were waiting for him to plunge into the crowd in his wheeled conveyance, he went to every person in a wheelchair. And the thing that really moved me, though, was after greeting each one, he didn't move on to the next one. He reached back to touch the caregiver, the person behind the wheelchair, and spoke to them. And I thought, some things you don't fake. Some things you don't fake. Ladies and gentlemen, what an honor it is for me to be with you. I look forward to continuing the conversation outside. Thank you so much.